A number of considerations are relevant in determining when or under what circumstances suicide is appropriate. I want to briefly discuss the following three, which seem to me to be central. Considerations about death for the one who dies, death's impact on others, and methods of dying. So, on the first of these, death for the one who dies, Epicurus claimed over 2,000 years ago that death is nothing to us, for when we are, death isn't, and when death is, we will exist no longer. Therefore, death concerns neither the living nor the dead. And one challenge to this view that remains particularly influential is Thomas Nagel's. And Nagel approaches the question by identifying the badness of death as relational or comparative. That is, Nagel argues that while there's nothing intrinsically, that is in itself, bad about being dead, nonetheless, death is a misfortune for the one who dies insofar as it deprives this individual of the good things in life that they would have enjoyed had they continued living. And Nagel illustrates this by using the following example. Suppose a brilliant mind suffers a brain injury, and as a result of this is reduced to the mental condition of a contented infant. The question is, has something bad happened to this person? I think lots of people would think this is a misfortune for this individual, but notice that the misfortune lies not in the state of being a contented infant, which, for the sake of argument, we're assuming is not at all bad state to be in, but rather in the loss of a condition that was good or desirable, or to be more precise, good on balance. Similarly, if death is bad, it's bad not because there's something intrinsically bad about being dead. It's bad because of the good of which one is deprived, and death is worse the more net good one would have enjoyed. Those who accept this view of death, however, typically acknowledge that it can also work in the opposite direction. That is, if one's life is bad on balance and is likely to continue in this poor condition, the loss of it is good on this view, comparatively. And it's by combining this sort of view about death with a thoroughly pessimistic view of existence that I derive a pro-mortal or pro-mortalist position, according to which death is good for the one who dies. But even if one accepts this, one has to nonetheless confront the unhappy fact that one's death is often bad for others. Death generally causes grief and suffering for those related to the deceased. I'm inclined to think, however, that the relationship between the individual and others has to be of a certain kind in order to outweigh the benefit of suicide, namely one of dependence. If take a very simple example, it is A's responsibility to provide food and other vital needs for B, A's suicide will be morally problematic. But now suppose A is living alone, and though A has family, friends, and so forth, their relationship with A is quite a distant one, not one of strong dependence. They may, of course, still mourn the death of A, and no doubt we should give some weight to this. But it's not a case of strong dependence, material or emotional, and so I think suicide can generally be morally justified in these cases. Now, two things need to be said about the potentially problematic cases involving dependence. One is that saying that suicide in such circumstances is morally problematic does not necessarily tell us what the legal status of such cases ought to be, so I don't want to make that distinction. Second, if someone in a situation like this is suffering unbearable pain or agony, then I think these considerations about others can be morally overwritten, though one should, of course, try to ensure care for the dependent individual or individuals before dying so as to mitigate the harm. But even if death is good for the one who dies, and there is no one who depends on the individual in any vital way, it may still not follow that attempting to die is advisable. In a world in which access to reliable means of dying are largely denied to individuals, one often has to resort to highly dubious methods of self-annihilation. And this simply means that the considerable risk may be involved in attempting to take one's own life. I think this is a formidable obstacle to anyone considering suicide. However, it's one that can be lessened with some careful foresight. So I would just reiterate something I've said before about suicide methods, which is that in choosing between suicide methods, one should essentially seek to maximize reliability. So if one has two suicide methods open to them, one which involves some pain but is significantly more reliable than an alternative method which involves no pain when successful, it seems to me that one would be wise to choose the first. And this is because the consequences of an unsuccessful attempt are often much worse than the pain attached to the various suicide methods generally. Of course, if suicide, or rather, if assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia were to become universally allowed and accessible, this final consideration will not apply with anything like the force it currently has. But I think even in the absence of these, if an individual has access to a very reliable method of dying, and no one depends on the individual in any vital way, suicide seems appropriate. Or to put the point in slightly stronger terms, reasons seem to be more on the side of suicide. Of course, this doesn't mean I or anyone else am entitled to kill others if I believe others' lives meet these criteria. I think these are decisions that competent agents, competent individuals should ultimately make for themselves, and this for very good moral reasons.